The bell above the door chimed softly as Miss Thelma stepped into the diner, just as she did every afternoon at exactly noon. The place smelled of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon, a scent that clung to the air like a familiar melody. Without looking around, she made her way to table 7, the one by the window, the one that had been hers for years. She moved slowly, with the quiet dignity of someone who had seen too much of life to be in a hurry. Her dress, a faded floral print, hung loosely on her slender frame, and she carried a small, well-worn leather purse tucked neatly under her arm. As she slid into her seat, the sun streamed through the glass, casting soft golden light onto her dark skin, tracing the fine lines of age and memory on her face. She placed her purse beside her, her hands folding neatly on the table as she waited. Mary, the waitress, approached with a gentle smile. "The usual, Miss Thelma?" The old woman gave a single nod. No unnecessary words. Just a quiet understanding between the two. A few minutes later, a steaming cup of black coffee was placed before her, followed by a bowl of soup and a slice of cornbread. She ate slowly, methodically, her gaze fixed outside the window, where the world moved in chaotic rhythms, cars honking, people rushing, life happening. But in here, in her little corner of the world, everything was still. Thelma never checked her phone. Never read a book. Never carried a newspaper. She simply sat, eating in silence, as if waiting for something, or someone, that never came. The other patrons of the diner barely noticed her. A group of construction workers laughed loudly at the counter. A young mother struggled to keep her toddler from knocking over a glass of juice. A businessman, always in a rush, typed furiously on his phone, barely glancing at his sandwich. James was that businessman. He had been coming to the diner for months, always sitting a few tables away, always absorbed in emails, phone calls, and the endless demands of his work. But today was different. As he reached for his coffee, his eyes flicked toward the old woman by the window. There was something about her stillness that unsettled him. Unlike everyone else, she seemed to exist in a different kind of time, untouched by the rush of the world. "Hey, Mary," he said, motioning the waitress over. "Who's the woman at table 7? Mary glanced over, then back at James with a small smile. "That's Miss Thelma. Comes in every day. Same time. Same table. Same order. Always alone?" "Always," Mary said. Then, with a knowing look, she added, "Been that way for years." James frowned, watching the old woman as she took another slow sip of her coffee. There was something about her, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. And for the first time in months, he put his phone down. The diner bustled around them, plates clinking, conversations murmuring, the hiss of coffee being poured, but at table 7, the world felt quieter. James sat across from Miss Thelma, watching her as she stirred the last of her coffee, lost in thought. "So," he finally said, leaning forward, "tell me about him." Miss Thelma didn't look up right away. Instead, she traced the rim of her cup with a slow, steady hand. James wondered if she would answer at all. Then, softly, she said, "Henry." James nodded, waiting. "We met in this very diner," she continued, her voice carrying the weight of years. "I was just a girl, fresh out of school, working as a waitress. Henry was bold, too bold. Sat right there in that seat and told me I had the prettiest smile he'd ever seen." She chuckled, shaking her head. "I told him to get lost." James grinned. "And yet, here we are." Miss Thelma smirked. "Persistence, boy. That man came back every single day, ordered the same coffee, left the same big tip, just so I'd notice him." James could almost picture it, a younger version of her, rolling her eyes at some charming, smooth-talking man who refused to take no for an answer. "Did you ever tell him he won you over?" James asked. Miss Thelma's smile softened. "Didn't have to. One day, I sat down right across from him. Just like you did with me." James felt something shift in his chest. This wasn't just a story. It was a memory so vivid it lingered in this very space. Miss Thelma exhaled deeply. 54 years, we sat here. Talked about everything and nothing. Even when words got scarce, we always had this table. James hesitated before asking, and then? Her fingers tightened around the coffee cup. And then one day, he didn't come. Silence settled between them. James didn't push, he didn't need to. He knew the rest of the story without her saying another word. She inhaled, steadying herself. I thought if I kept coming back, maybe it would hurt less. James nodded. Did it? Miss Thelma looked at him, really looked at him, as if trying to decide whether to tell the truth. No, she admitted. But I guess it kept me from forgetting. James leaned back, letting her words settle. People were always rushing, moving forward, telling themselves to let go. But Miss Thelma had held on, anchoring herself in the last place she had shared with the man she loved. And yet, for the first time, she wasn't sitting here alone. James lifted his coffee cup in a small toast. To Henry. Miss Thelma stared at him for a moment, then, slowly, she lifted her cup, too. To Henry. And just like that, the past and the present sat together at table 7. Miss Thelma stirred her coffee, slow and deliberate, as if she had all the time in the world. James, on the other hand, was used to rushed conversations, quick decisions, and keeping things moving. But here, sitting across from her, time felt different, like it had slowed down just for them. She didn't speak right away, and James found himself waiting, letting the silence settle between them like an old habit. Finally, Miss Thelma glanced up. You always watch people like that? James smirked. Only when they're interesting. Her lips curved slightly, not quite a smile but something close. And what makes me interesting? He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. You come here every day. Same table, same order. You never seem in a rush, and you're always alone. That's not something you see much these days. Miss Thelma took a slow sip of her coffee. And that bothers you? James shrugged. Not bothers me. Just makes me wonder. She exhaled softly, setting her cup down. People always in a hurry to figure folks out. Sometimes, there ain't no mystery. Sometimes, folks just are. James leaned back. Is that what this is? Just a habit? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked out the window, watching the world move. Cars passing, people rushing, the city humming with life. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter. Once upon a time, I sat here with someone else. James felt something shift. The air between them, the weight of her words. He didn't press, didn't interrupt. He just listened. Miss Thelma traced a finger along the rim of her coffee cup. We used to share this table. Every day, same time, same meal. We'd sit here and watch the world go by, just like this. She paused, then added, then one day, he stopped coming. James stayed quiet, letting her lead the moment. She inhaled deeply, then exhaled as if releasing something heavy. People move on. Life moves on. But I guess I never did. James studied her carefully. So you kept coming back? Miss Thelma nodded. Some folks forget too easy. I didn't want to be one of them. James felt something tighten in his chest. He wasn't sure what to say. He had walked into this conversation expecting a simple answer, but Miss Thelma wasn't simple. She was a story waiting to be told, one that wasn't finished yet. Finally, he spoke. Maybe you're not waiting anymore. Miss Thelma raised an eyebrow. Oh? James gestured between them. Because now, you're not alone. For a long moment, she just looked at him. Then, slowly, she nodded. Maybe you're right. She took another sip of coffee. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't waiting for someone who wouldn't come back. She was here. And so was he. James wasn't the type to second-guess himself. He made decisions fast and stuck with them. But as he stood in front of table 7, staring down at the old woman who had spent years eating alone, he hesitated. Miss Thelma didn't look up. She simply stirred her coffee, slow and deliberate, as if she had all the time in the world. It was almost as if she knew he was there but wasn't in a hurry to acknowledge him. James cleared his throat. "Mind if I sit here?" Her hand stilled over the cup. For a moment, he thought she might refuse. But then, without looking at him, she gestured toward the empty seat across from her. James slid into the chair. The air between them was thick with silence, not uncomfortable, but heavy, like stepping into a story already in progress. Up close, he could see the fine lines on her face, the quiet strength in her dark eyes. She took another sip of coffee, then finally looked at him. "You don't belong here." James blinked. "Excuse me?" Miss Thelma raised a brow. "This isn't your table." He let out a small chuckle, caught off guard. "No, I suppose it's not." She set her cup down. "So, why are you here?" James considered that for a moment. He wasn't sure himself. He had no real reason to be sitting here, across from this woman he barely knew. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was guilt. Or maybe it was something deeper, something he hadn't figured out yet. "I noticed you," he admitted. "You come here every day. Always alone." Miss Thelma gave a small, knowing smile. "Most people don't notice." "Well, I did." She studied him for a moment before nodding. "All right, then. Since you're here, might as well introduce yourself." "James." She nodded again. "Miss Thelma." He already knew that, but hearing her say it felt different. More real. Mary walked by, raising an amused eyebrow as she set another cup of coffee in front of James. He ignored her smirk. Miss Thelma took another slow sip. "You always that bold, James?" "Not usually," he admitted. "Guess I just figured it was time someone sat with you." She exhaled a soft laugh, more breath than sound. "And what makes you think I want company?" James leaned back slightly. "Because if you really didn't, you would have told me to leave." Miss Thelma held his gaze for a moment, then nodded approvingly. Smart man. The silence that followed wasn't heavy anymore. It settled between them like an old song, something familiar, something neither of them needed to rush. James took a sip of his coffee, the warmth settling in his chest. Maybe he was right where he needed to be. James hated distractions. His life was built on precision, meetings scheduled to the minute, emails answered in seconds, efficiency woven into everything he did. But today, something broke his rhythm. It was her. The old woman by the window. She sat at table 7, just as she had every day for months, maybe years, without fail. He had seen her before, but only in the way people see passing cars or background noise. But today, he noticed her. Miss Thelma. She wasn't checking a phone, flipping through a newspaper, or rushing through a meal. She simply existed in the space, moving at a pace the world had forgotten. She sipped her coffee, eyes drifting beyond the glass, watching life go by with a quiet patience. James found himself staring. "Need a refill?" He blinked. Mary, the waitress, stood beside him, coffee pot in hand, smirking slightly. He glanced down at his half-full cup. "No, I'm good." Mary followed his gaze to table 7 and nodded knowingly. "Miss Thelma." James raised an eyebrow. "You know her?" Mary poured coffee into another customer's cup. "Everyone here does. She's been coming in for years. Same time, same table, same order." James leaned forward. "And always alone?" Mary sighed. "Always." She set the coffee pot down and gave him a look. "She never misses a day. Even on holidays, she's here. Just sits there, eats, and watches the world outside." James frowned, intrigued. "Why?" Mary shrugged. "No one really knows. She doesn't talk much about herself. Just eats her meal, leaves a $1 tip, and goes. Some folks think she's waiting for someone. Others think she just likes the routine. James glanced back at the old woman. There was something about her solitude that unsettled him. She wasn't just alone, she was waiting. But for what? Or who? His phone buzzed. A reminder of an upcoming meeting. His fingers moved to pick it up, but for the first time in a long time, he hesitated. Instead, he asked a question he never would have asked yesterday. What if I sat with her? Mary gave him a surprised look. You? Mr. Always in a hurry? James smirked. Yeah. Why not? Mary chuckled. I don't know, but if you do, I'd love to see it. James exhaled, pushing his chair back. His body moved before his mind caught up. The bell above the diner door rang as someone else entered, but James barely noticed. He was already on his feet, walking toward table 7. Miss Thelma didn't look up. Not yet. But something told him she knew he was coming. The sun was high, the smell of barbecue filled the air, and laughter echoed through the park. Families gathered around checkered picnic blankets, kids ran between tables, and the steady hum of conversation mixed with the strum of a live band. James stood near the entrance, scanning the crowd, heart thumping just a little harder than he expected. Then, he saw her. Miss Thelma stood near the edge of the gathering, wearing a soft lavender dress, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She wasn't quite in the crowd, but she was here. And that was enough. James grinned and walked over. Well, he said. Look who decided to show up. Miss Thelma gave him a look, but he caught the faintest twitch of a smile. Figured I'd see what all the fuss was about. James motioned toward the tables. Come on, let me introduce you to some people. She hesitated, fingers tightening around the small purse she carried. I don't know, James. He softened. It's just a picnic, Miss Thelma. You don't have to do anything but eat good food and let people be happier here. She exhaled slowly, then nodded. All right, lead the way. James guided her through the crowd, introducing her to a few familiar faces. People smiled, shook her hand, welcomed her without hesitation. He saw the way she absorbed it all, the warmth, the noise, the sheer life of it. When they reached one of the long picnic tables, James pulled out a chair. Have a seat. Miss Thelma hesitated for just a second longer before finally lowering herself into the chair. And just like that, she wasn't alone at a table anymore. Mary, from the diner, appeared out of nowhere, setting a plate in front of Miss Thelma. There, she said. Figured you wouldn't get food for yourself, so I took care of it. Miss Thelma blinked, looking down at the plate, barbecue ribs, cornbread, collard greens. The kind of meal that felt like home. She looked up at Mary. Thank you. Mary just smirked. Don't thank me yet. You still have to finish it all. Laughter rippled through the table, and something in Miss Thelma's posture eased. As James sat beside her, he noticed how she looked around, not with sadness this time, but with quiet curiosity. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't just watching life from a distance. She was in it. James picked up his fork and nudged her plate. You know, I think Henry would have liked this. Miss Thelma smiled softly. Yeah, she said, looking around at the people, the food, the laughter. I think he would have. And as she took her first bite, James knew this was just the beginning. James didn't usually hesitate before walking into the diner, but today, he stood outside for a moment, watching Miss Thelma through the window. She sat at table 7, as always, but something about her posture felt different. Lighter. As if the weight she carried every morning had shifted, even if just a little. He took a breath and pushed open the door. Miss Thelma looked up as he slid into his usual seat. Thought maybe you'd finally had enough of my company, she said, smirking over her coffee. James grinned. Not a chance. Mary, already knowing the drill, set down his coffee without a word. She lingered for a second, raising an eyebrow at the two of them. You two really are a sight. Like a damn movie I didn't know I needed to watch. Miss Thelma chuckled. Hope it's a good one. Mary winked and walked off, leaving them in their little corner of the world. James wrapped his hands around his coffee cup, considering his next words carefully. He had been thinking about this since yesterday, since that conversation about Henry, about memories, about how some things stayed even when people didn't. "Miss Thelma," he started, "you ever go anywhere besides here?" She raised an eyebrow. "Boy, I've been plenty of places." He shook his head, smiling. "I mean lately." She hesitated, looking down at her coffee. "Not much reason to." James leaned forward. "What if I gave you one?" Miss Thelma glanced up, eyes narrowing. "And what exactly are you scheming?" He pulled something from his pocket and slid it across the table. A folded piece of paper. She gave him a suspicious look before picking it up and unfolding it. A flyer. Community picnic, Saturday afternoon. Miss Thelma's lips pressed together. "What's this?" James shrugged. "Just a little something that happens every year. Families, food, music. Nothing fancy." He paused. "Thought you might like it." She set the flyer down, her fingers lingering on the paper. "James, I haven't done something like this in a long time." "That's why you should," he said simply. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked past him, out the window, as if searching for something she wasn't sure she'd find. "I don't know," she murmured. James smiled. "Think about it. No pressure." Miss Thelma exhaled, shaking her head. "You're a stubborn one, you know that?" He grinned. "I've had a good teacher." She chuckled, but there was something thoughtful in her expression now. A hesitation, yes, but also a possibility. James didn't need an answer right away. He just needed her to consider it. And as she stared at that flyer, fingers tracing the edges, he knew she was. James walked into the diner, expecting to see Miss Thelma in her usual spot. But today, something felt different. She wasn't looking out the window. She wasn't stirring her coffee in that slow, thoughtful way. Instead, she was staring down at the table, fingers gently tracing the wood, lost in a memory James couldn't see. He hesitated before sliding into the seat across from her. "Morning, Miss Thelma." She blinked, as if pulled back from somewhere far away. "Morning, James." But her voice lacked its usual spark. James set his coffee down. "Something on your mind?" She exhaled, her fingers still resting on the table. "You ever feel like a place can hold memories?" James glanced around the diner. The cracked leather booths, the faint scent of syrup in coffee, the old jukebox in the corner that hadn't worked in years. He thought about how, just a week ago, this place had been nothing to him. Just another stop in the city, another place people passed through. But now? Now, it felt like something more. "Yeah," he said finally. "I think I'm starting to understand." Miss Thelma gave a small nod. "This table," she tapped the wood lightly. "This table has held more than just meals. It's held laughter. Arguments. Silence. Love." Her voice softened. "Henry used to drum his fingers on the edge when he got impatient. Drove me crazy. And now? I'd give anything to hear that sound again." James swallowed, his usual easy confidence replaced by something quieter. "You miss him?" Miss Thelma gave a small, sad smile. "Every day." Silence settled between them. Not heavy, not uncomfortable. Just real. James leaned forward. "Tell me about him." Miss Thelma looked at him then, really looked at him, as if deciding whether she wanted to open that door. After a long pause, she sighed. "Henry was stubborn. Thought he knew everything." She chuckled. "But he loved big. Made life feel like an adventure, even when we weren't going anywhere." James smiled. "Sounds like my kind of guy." Miss Thelma shook her head, but there was warmth in her eyes. "He'd have liked you. Would have given you hell, but he'd have liked you." James chuckled, picturing some old man sizing him up, making him work for approval. I'd have liked him too. For the first time that morning, Miss Thelma's shoulders relaxed a little. The weight of the past still lingered, but it didn't feel so heavy. James picked up his coffee. You ever think maybe the memories aren't just in this table? Miss Thelma tilted her head. What do you mean? He met her gaze. Maybe they're in you. And maybe they don't go away just because life moves on. Miss Thelma studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Maybe you're right. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel quite so alone. James never thought of himself as a man of routine. His days were built around deadlines, shifting schedules, and unpredictable meetings. But somehow, without even realizing it, he had fallen into one. Every morning now, before the city fully woke up, before his inbox filled with demands, he came here. To table 7. To Miss Thelma. She was already there when he walked in, just like always. A fresh cup of coffee in front of her, hands wrapped around the warm ceramic. This time, though, when he slid into the chair across from her, she didn't pretend to be surprised. She just gave a knowing smirk. Morning, James. James grinned. Morning, Miss Thelma. Mary appeared with his usual coffee, no need to ask anymore. She set the cup down and shook her head. I swear, if you two start ordering the same meal, I might just faint. Miss Thelma chuckled. Better get the smelling salts ready. Mary laughed and walked off, leaving them in their quiet corner of the world. James took a sip of his coffee, letting the warmth settle. Then he glanced at Miss Thelma. You ever wonder what people think when they see us sitting here? She raised an eyebrow. What, an old black woman and a young white man sharing breakfast? I imagine they think we're plotting something. James chuckled. Maybe we are. Miss Thelma leaned back, eyes twinkling. And what exactly are we plotting, James? He thought for a moment, staring at the steam curling from his cup. I don't know. But I think it starts with making time for the things that matter. She studied him, nodding slowly. Now that sounds like a plan. For a while, they ate in silence, watching the world move past the diner window. Cars rushing. People hurrying. Life moving too fast, the way it always did. But inside, at their table, everything felt steady. James finally broke the silence. You ever thought about not coming here? Miss Thelma set her cup down. You ever thought about not coming here? James hesitated. A week ago, he wouldn't have even noticed this diner, let alone sat down in it. But now, the thought of skipping a morning at table 7 felt wrong. Like something important would be missing. I guess I haven't, he admitted. Miss Thelma nodded, as if she already knew the answer. Then I suppose we both have our reasons for showing up. James smirked. You still think I don't know mine? She chuckled softly. Oh, you're getting closer. James shook his head, grinning. You're impossible, you know that? Miss Thelma just sipped her coffee, eyes twinkling with something between wisdom and mischief. And just like that, without saying it, they both knew this was more than just a table. It was a beginning. The next morning, James walked into the diner a little earlier than usual. He told himself it was for the coffee, maybe to get a head start on the day. But as his eyes scanned the room, he knew the real reason. Table 7. And there she was. Miss Thelma sat in her usual spot by the window, her hands wrapped around a warm coffee cup, staring out at the world like she always did. Only now, something was different. She wasn't alone. James crossed the room and slid into the seat across from her without waiting for an invitation. Miss Thelma didn't look up immediately, but he caught the faintest smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. You again, she said. Me again, James replied, signaling Mary for coffee. She shook her head, stirring her drink with a slow, methodical rhythm. A man's got places to be. Work to do. But here you are. James shrugged. Guess I'm making time. Miss Thelma finally looked at him, her gaze sharp, studying. Most folks don't make time unless they're looking for something. James sipped his coffee, considering her words. She wasn't wrong. He had spent years wrapped up in deadlines, calls, emails, moving so fast that people had become background noise. But Miss Thelma had stopped him in his tracks. And now, he was here. Maybe this was what he had been missing. "What do you think I'm looking for?" he asked. Miss Thelma took her time answering, her fingers tapping lightly against her cup. Then, she said, "Maybe you don't know yet." James chuckled. "You always this mysterious?" She smirked. "Only when people are listening." Mary appeared at the table, setting down James's usual coffee and an extra plate of toast. She glanced between them, amusement flickering in her eyes. "So, this is a thing now?" James met Miss Thelma's gaze. "Guess so." Miss Thelma raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. Instead, she picked up a piece of toast, breaking off a small bite. For the first time, she wasn't just waiting, she was sharing. They sat there for a while, drinking their coffee, eating in silence. But it wasn't an empty silence. It was the kind that settled comfortably between two people who had decided, in some unspoken way, that they were exactly where they needed to be. James glanced out the window, watching the world rush by. He thought about how, just days ago, he had been one of those people, too busy to notice, too distracted to care. But now, he was here. With her. And somehow, that felt like the most important meeting of his day.